Welcome to this presentation on Bowen's family systems theory. My name is Nathan Villasenor, representing the University of Western States. Bowen's family systems theory is a processional theory presented in 1967 that investigates how a family's structure, history, habits, and members contribute to its development and ability to overcome adversity. In this presentation, we're going to go over the theory concepts, the therapeutic processes that therapists use to engage in this theory, and some special considerations that may affect how effective the application of this theory might be in one's practice. Before we move forward, though, we first have to go over some assumptions and definitions that are central to this theory and understood by therapists who wish to employ it. As far as assumptions go, the first is that the family is an emotional unit. More than just a system of individuals who simply live together, each individual only as invested as they wish to be, this assumption states that the entire family moves in unison with its members. One member's problems deeply affect another's functioning and the unit's functioning as a whole. This leads us to our second assumption, that the family functions are interdependent. As I stated, the needs, the successes and changes and failures of one member or group of members leads to reactions from other members of the system, even if it seems insignificant or unrelated. The third assumption is that threats to the system create anxieties. And we'll define anxieties in just a moment, but those anxieties and the threats that maintain them are specifically what Bowenian theorists look at when considering a psychopathology for the family unit. The final assumption is that the goal is differentiation management. We'll also define differentiation very soon, but it should be understood that the more differentiated a person becomes, the less anxieties they have, the more security they have, and the less personal psychopathologies they may encounter. Now here we define two key words for this theory: anxiety and differentiation. Note that anxiety isn't necessarily a pathological anxiety, for instance, social anxiety disorder. Rather, it's a defined reaction to a threat or obstacle in the family's typical functioning. It can represent itself in a number of ways. If there's a tension between a husband and wife, it's an anxiety. If there's a disruption between mother and child in which the mother's fear that the child might get sick forces her to excessively give them preventative medication, and that results in dysfunction in that child, there's an anxiety. And as anxieties rise, families might go through intense measures of suppressing those anxieties, though, as we'll see, they're not always productive long term. Differentiation is the other key word for this theory, and really it's just the ability to regulate between interpersonal and intrapersonal priorities. It's an emotional maturity, and it's a balancing act between extremes. Differentiation, as I mentioned, is the goal of this kind of therapy, and the ability to self-regulate for all members of our family unit is what will help temper down those anxieties and balance out those extremes. This theory is named after Dr. Murray Bowen, a Tennessee-born psychiatrist and researcher. He ended up spending time with the National Institute of Mental Health studying whole families, and while he was there, he recognized patterns in families that indicate the existence of systems in familial relationships. When we look at the theory of Bowen's family's systems, we have to take a look at their view of psychopathology and the 8 concepts that Bowen put together. As far as the view of psychopathology goes, there's not really a focus on mental illness. Rather, mental illness is seen as one of the anxieties. It's something that develops because there's some kind of an imbalance in the family unit, some kind of an anxiety that has popped up, and that's what really creates situations where the family isn't functioning as it should be. And for that reason, the problems are very human. They're relational. If we're having issues within the family unit, rather than it being something that's out of our hands or unexplainable, or something that needs a vast amount of medications or therapies for, the problems are manageable and identifiable and something that we can change within our own relationships. The other thing is that anxieties are emotional responses to threats rather than something that, again, is foreign and unexplainable. Once we can identify the threat and the anxiety that it's maintaining, we can make adjustments to the family and see exactly how much our adjustments can positively affect the family's differentiation. The last thing is that poor differentiation between the family members leads to emotional reactivity. If an individual in a family is not prepared to differentiate between their problems, then they might not be able to react the way that would support positive family functioning. But by promoting differentiation, we can work to fix the entire family unit. Now, when Bowen was studying his families, he noticed a variety of patterns, as previously mentioned, and he put together the 8 concepts. And those concepts are differentiation of self, triangulations, the nuclear family process, family projection, multi-generational transmission process, sibling position, emotional cutoff, and societal emotional process. We'll take a look at differentiation of self. And this is the ability to recognize one's dependence on others, but still strive for autonomy and control of the self, especially in relationships. Again, we mentioned that differentiation is kind of a balance between extremes. And in this example of the definition, we see that there's an individual who understands that they are autonomous, that they have personal needs, but they're also involved in a relationship, some kind of a familial situation. And the ability to strike a balance between the self and the identification as part of a family unit is important, because if you devote too much time for yourself, you'll see that the individual is very withdrawn and not caring as much about the family unit. But if they devote too much time to the family unit itself, then they start to neglect themselves in favor of the family. And sometimes that produces an anxiety about the other family members that really should be resolved by them taking a little bit of a look into how they can differentiate themselves. Seeing triangulations, this is a tendency to attempt to manage tension between 2 individuals in a family by inviting a third entity into the relationship. In our example, we have a husband and a wife, and they are currently experiencing some kind of a tension. And so what happens is they involve a third individual. The classic example would be a child, and they both try to foster a positive relationship with that child. Now, the reason why this definition includes the word entity rather than person is because some researchers have found that the third thing that is involved in trying to mitigate anxieties between 2 parties could be something like watching TV or extravagant spending. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a person that the couple that's experiencing anxiety between them focuses on, but rather it's anything that they both put their energy into in order to try and fix their tension. The problem with this, however, is that it's not really a fix to the tension that might be existing in their relationship. Rather, it's just distracting them from the issue, and that tension will still be there once the distraction is gone. We move down to the nuclear family process. This is when tension raises between 2 members of the family and attempts to relieve that tension are engaged in. So we see a few more examples of how we can go ahead and try to relieve the tension within our own families. Again, let's say we have a husband and a wife, and let's say that because of their tension, they are recognizing that they're trying to move away from each other. They're moving in different directions. This is called emotional distance. They don't really care as much about each other's needs and feelings. They're more kind of separating themselves, and this is what kind of creates that, we're missing intimacy in our relationship. We're emotionally distant. Now, the 2 individuals can go in opposite direction, and this is called marital conflict. This is what we see when families are explosive. They're always fighting. The husband and wife can't ever get along, something like that. Another one is when one individual moves in one direction. This is called dysfunction in spouse. The interesting thing to note is that while one individual is moving in one direction, it's not really that the other individual, in this case the wife, is not moving in any direction at all. She's also moving the exact same direction. For instance, if the husband spiraled into some kind of a depression because of an issue that he's having, and she decides to accommodate everything and devote herself to his depression, she's not looking after her own issues. She's suffering a differentiation of self issue. Then they are both moving in the same direction in their relationship. And the last one is an impairment in another. So this is when one individual is included in the situation. For instance, usually this is now actually a child, but again, the parents have some kind of attention, and instead of focusing on the child positively as they would in a triangulation, there's some kind of an impairment that might be created for that child. The next is family projection. This is when a parent might focus on a child, projecting their anxieties and worries onto that child, and this results in an impairment of the child's functioning, and through no fault of the child's at all. Sorry, I jumped the gun just a little bit. With family projection, this is kind of like that example that I gave at the beginning of the presentation, where there's a mother who is vastly concerned that something might be going on with her child, and so she overprescribes preventative medication, and that cocktail of medications actually creates an issue of dysfunction for the child. In this case, the child really didn't have any option to refuse the medications that the mother was prescribing, but because the mother was so obsessed with the child's not having the proper adaptation to sickness, they actually created a sickness within them. The multi-generational transmission process is the generational, seemingly small changes in differentiation from parent to child that result in vast differential progressions over time. Very simply, imagine you have one generation of a couple, a husband and a wife, and they each have their own differentiation styles, and they have 2 children, a son and a daughter. But because they had those children perhaps at different times, and those children had different friends, and they were raised in different systems, those children might be differently differentiated between each other and between the parents. One child might be more differentiated from the parents, and the other one might be less differentiated compared to the parents. Now let's say that those children have children of their own. And again, the child who was more differentiated, their children become even more differentiated, both in relation to their parents, but also their grandparents. And the other child who was less differentiated from the grandparents has their own children, and those children become more differentiated between themselves and their parent and their grandparents. So we see that these small changes in differentiation from one generation to the next actually might lead to huge differences across generations, which is why we see a lot of times children and their grandparents not getting along or not understanding the other's point of view. Sibling position is something that Bowen borrowed from Walter Tolman, and this is the phenomenon where across families, children who grow up in the same position as other children eventually develop similar differentiation levels and family patterns. A very simple example would be that the oldest child tends to be in a leader position and the youngest child tends to be in a follower position. The second to last one is emotional cutoff, and this is when some people attempt to manage family tension by cutting off members of the family with whom they have a poor relationship. We can see this when, for instance, let's say your mom is not talking to your uncle ever again, and they've sworn off of talking to them. And the reason why is because they've had so many fights, so many disagreements throughout their life that she feels that she cannot be emotionally connected to that person. She's tried to cut them off. The thing is, though, this isn't an indication of no emotional connection. Rather, it might be an indication of a very strong emotional connection in which the person who's doing the cutoff is so emotionally invested in the person who they're cutting off that they feel that the only way that they can ease the tension between them is to try and get off of them altogether. And this is where we see a little bit of a paradox. They're going from one extreme to the other in terms of their emotional connectedness from the person, but it's saying actually that they're very connected to that person. The last one is the societal emotional process. Bowen noted that emotional functioning in family relationships often parallels emotional functioning in greater society. So when examining a family unit and you see when someone is lacking differentiation skills within the family unit and they're spiraling out of control, you might also see that very same pattern at work or among friends or in social events. And so often the emotional processes within the family unit reflects how they're functioning in greater society.